Nadia Osei walked out of her marriage on a Wednesday morning in March with $411, a duffel bag, and the specific clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years pretending she did not know what she knew and had finally stopped pretending. Her husband's name was Marcus. He was 44 years old and worked in commercial real estate and had a quality of surface confidence that she had found compelling at 31 and had come to understand at 47 was the specific confidence of a man who had never been seriously contradicted and had mistaken the absence of contradiction for the presence of competence. He was not a bad man in the ways that registered obviously. He did not raise his hand. He did not disappear for days. He was present and consistent and certain in the way of someone who had decided what things were and did not revise those decisions when the evidence suggested revision was warranted. What Marcus had decided early in their marriage, and what he had communicated in the particular low-frequency way that decisions communicated themselves without being spoken, was that Nadia's contribution to their shared life was domestic and supportive, and that this contribution, while valued in the abstract, did not translate into a meaningful voice in the decisions that shaped the life it was supporting. He had managed the money with the authority of someone who considered financial management a natural extension of his professional competence, and had not invited her into the specifics of it with any regularity. He had made the large decisions, where they lived and what they drove and how they spent and what they saved, with the presumption of someone who expected agreement and received it because Nadia had been, for 15 years, a person who agreed when agreeing was easier than the alternative. The alternative had become easier the morning she found the second phone. Not hidden exactly, left in the car's center console in the way things were left when a person had stopped being careful, because careful required energy, and they had redirected that energy elsewhere. She had found it on a Saturday morning when she was looking for a parking ticket she needed to deal with, and the phone had been there, and the phone had been unlocked, because it was a Saturday morning, and Saturday mornings were apparently a time when careful was not required. She had looked at it for 30 seconds. She had put it back and found the parking ticket, and paid the parking ticket, and gone home and made dinner, and said nothing for 6 months, while she made the specific preparations that a woman made when she had decided to leave a situation she had been in for 15 years, and intended to do so with as much of herself intact as possible. The preparations had been limited by the financial reality she had uncovered during the 6 months of saying nothing. The money was in accounts that were in Marcus's name, having been reorganized during a refinancing 3 years earlier, in a way that Nadia had signed off on without understanding the implications, and that a lawyer she had consulted quietly and at her own cost had explained to her with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that was both true and bad. She had her own account, a personal account she had maintained throughout the marriage for household purchases, which currently held $411. She had her jewelry, which was modest. She had the duffel bag. She had a 15-year gap in her employment history that she had spent working on her food, developing and refining and cooking for every person who had ever come to their house, which was frequently because Marcus entertained professionally, and Nadia had cooked those entertainments with a consistency and a quality that his colleagues had commented on for 15 years, in the specific way people commented on food that was better than they had expected. She had the food. That was what she had. 15 years of cooking at a level that had never been professionally validated, because there had been no professional context for it, only the domestic one, which was the context that did not count in the way Marcus meant when he used the word count. She stayed with her friend Josephine for the first 2 weeks. Josephine was 51 and had been through her own version of this particular geography 11 years earlier, and had navigated it with the specific competence of someone who had mapped the terrain and retained the map. She did not offer pity. She offered the spare room and a direct conversation on the first evening about what Nadia had and what Nadia needed, and how large the gap between them was. The gap was large. Nadia was 47 years old, with $411 and 15 years of gap in her employment record, in a city that valued credentials with the specific mercilessness of places where the competition was dense and the tolerance for unconventional trajectories was limited. She had the food. She spent the first week at Josephine's writing down everything she could cook, not as an exercise in cataloging what she knew, but as a practice of taking seriously what she had always had, and had never formally acknowledged as something worth taking seriously. She wrote in the notebook she had bought with 6 of her $411 because the notebook was a necessary cost, and she had stopped apologizing for necessary costs. She wrote for 3 days and filled 41 pages. Josephine, who worked in marketing and had a professional relationship with the value of things, looked at the 41 pages on the third evening and said that Nadia had a menu and that a menu needed a place to happen. Nadia said she did not have the money for a place. Josephine said, "What does available money usually mean, and where is it usually found?" Nadia said she did not know what she was looking for. Josephine said she thought Nadia did know and should look at the county tax auction listings, because she had a friend who had found something there once, and it had been the right kind of nothing that became something. Nadia looked at the county tax auction listings. She found the listing on a Thursday evening, sitting at Josephine's kitchen table with the notebook open beside her laptop. The property was described as a former food service premises at the corner of Aldine Street and Merchant Road, in a neighborhood called Carver Hill, that Nadia knew in the specific way of someone who had driven through it regularly for 15 years without ever stopping. A neighborhood in the transition between what it had been and what it was becoming. The specific liminal condition of urban areas where the old businesses had mostly closed and the new ones had not entirely arrived. The former food service premises had accumulated its tax liability through the estate of a woman named Gloria Trent, who had operated a cafe called Gloria's at that address for 23 years before closing it 4 years ago, when her health had made continuing impossible. Gloria had died without direct heirs, and with an estate that had been in administrative limbo since her death, the tax liability accruing at a rate that reflected a property whose assessed value was low enough that the county had not prioritized resolving it. The outstanding liability was $312. Nadia had $411. She read the listing 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time. She called the county tax office the following morning and asked the questions she needed to ask in the organized way she asked things when she was taking something seriously. The premises were described as a single-story commercial building of approximately 600 square feet, with an operational kitchen, a counter service area, 4 tables, and an outdoor terrace on the Merchant Road side that was currently in poor condition. She asked about the kitchen specifically. The clerk, a man named Howard, who had the efficient patience of someone accustomed to fielding calls from prospective bidders, said the kitchen had been the subject of a county inspection 2 years prior and had been described as dated but substantially intact. Commercial refrigeration in place, commercial range in place, ventilation system in place. The inspection had noted that the premises would require updating to meet current health code standards before a food service license could be issued, but the infrastructure was present. She asked about the auction. Howard said it was in 9 days. She said she would be there. She spent the 9 days doing what she had spent 30 years learning to do, without applying the learning to anything that had her name on it. She researched the neighborhood. She walked Aldine Street and Merchant Road at different times of day and on different days, and watched who moved through and where they stopped and where they did not stop and why. She sat in the Pocket Park across from the former Gloria's on a Tuesday afternoon for 2 hours and watched the corner. The corner had something. She felt it before she could articulate it. The specific quality of a location that worked for the reasons certain locations worked, which was a combination of foot traffic and sightlines, and the way people naturally paused there because of the bus stop on the Merchant Road side and the park across the street and the angle of approach from the main road that delivered people to the corner in a particular way that made it visible from 3 directions simultaneously. She went inside on the 4th day, not inside the building which was locked and which she was not yet entitled to enter. She walked the perimeter and looked through the windows where the paper covering had gaps, and understood from what she could see that the description had been accurate, and that the kitchen through the pass-through window had the bones of something that had been used seriously and maintained by someone who took the work seriously. She found out about Gloria on the 5th day from a woman named Betty, who ran a small alterations business 2 doors down from the former cafe, and who had watched Nadia walking the perimeter with the alert attention of a woman who monitored her block, with the thoroughness of someone who had been there for 20 years and considered it her right. Betty said she had known Gloria for all 23 years, and that Gloria had been one of the best cooks she had ever encountered, and that the cafe had been the kind of place that people came to specifically and returned to consistently, and that the neighborhood had not recovered from its closure in the way that neighborhoods did not recover from losing something that had been genuinely good. She said she had watched 4 different people look at the property in the 4 years since Gloria died, and none of them had looked at it the way Nadia was looking at it. Nadia asked what way she was looking at it. Betty said like someone who understood what it had been. Nadia said she thought she might understand what it could be again. Betty looked at her for a moment. She said Gloria had a notebook. She said she did not know what had happened to it, but that Gloria had kept a notebook in the kitchen for the 23 years she was open and had written in it every day, recipes and modifications, and the things she had tried, and the things that had not worked, and the things that had worked so well, she had been afraid to change them. Nadia asked where the notebook might be. Bet said she thought it might be in the building. She said when Gloria had been taken to the care facility, she had left in a way that suggested she expected to come back, and that people who expected to come back left things rather than taking them. Nadia went to the auction. There were 6 people in the room. Most of them were there for the other properties on the day's list, a residential lot and a commercial storage unit that generated the majority of the morning's competitive bidding. The Aldine Street property was listed 3rd. Nadia raised her hand. Nobody else raised theirs. The clerk asked twice. Nobody else raised theirs. $312. She counted it from the 411 and handed it across the table, and received the deed and the key in exchange, and had $99 remaining, and owned a former cafe on the corner of Aldine Street and Merchant Road in Carver Hill. She called Josephine from the parking lot. Josephine said she was coming. Nadia said she did not need her to come. Josephine said she was coming anyway. They went to the building together. The key opened the front door with the specific resistance of a lock that had not been turned in 4 years and required the patient jiggling of someone who understood that resistance was not refusal. The interior was Gloria's, in the specific way that places were still the person who had filled them for 23 years, even 4 years after the filling had stopped. The counter along the left wall with its service area, the 4 tables, small and round with the same kind of chairs, wooden with a slight curve to the back, that was the curve of chairs chosen for comfort rather than style. The pass-through window to the kitchen, through which the range was visible in the dim interior, large and cast iron, and present with the authority of something built to outlast the use made of it. Josephine stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly. She said it needed work. Nadia said she knew. Josephine said it also had something. Nadia said she knew that too. She went through the pass-through into the kitchen. The kitchen was Gloria's kitchen in the same way the front room was Gloria's room. The layout of a person who had worked in it for 23 years and had organized it with the efficiency of someone for whom every inch of the space had a function and a reason. The range was large and intact. The refrigeration units were not running, but were present and appeared structurally sound. The ventilation above the range was the kind that had been installed properly by someone who understood what kitchen ventilation needed to do. On the shelf above the secondary prep counter, between a container of sea salt and a jar of dried herbs that had long since lost their potency, but that someone had lined up with care, was a notebook. Black cover, soft cover, the kind that was available at any stationery store and that lasted through years of kitchen use because the pages were thicker than standard and the binding was stitched rather than glued. She took it from the shelf. She opened it. Gloria's handwriting covered the pages in the dense, practical script of someone who wrote to record rather than to perform, filling the lines completely and using the margins for additions and modifications, and the occasional emphatic annotation in a different ink that suggested she had come back to things and found them requiring comment. The first page was dated 27 years ago, 4 years before the cafe opened. Gloria had been developing recipes before she had a place to make them. The notebook was the record of that development and everything that had followed it for 23 years of a working kitchen. Nadia stood at the prep counter in Gloria's kitchen and read. She read for an hour, moving through the notebook in the way she moved through things she was taking seriously. From the beginning, and at the pace the material required, rather than the pace her impatience suggested. She read recipes, and the thinking behind them, and the modifications that had come from years of making them, and the notes in the margins that were the conversation Gloria had been having with her own work across the span of a career. She understood the food, not in the sense of being able to replicate it from the descriptions alone, because recipes were not the same as understanding, in the sense that the thinking behind the food was the thinking of someone she recognized, the same orientation toward ingredients and technique, and the specific pleasure of a thing made right that she had brought to 15 years of cooking in a domestic context that had not counted. Josephine appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the notebook in Nadia's hands. She asked what it was. Nadia said it was 27 years of someone knowing what they were doing. Josephine said, was it useful? Nadia said it was more than useful. She set the notebook on the prep counter and looked at the kitchen. She looked at the range and the ventilation and the refrigeration and the layout that a person had organized over 23 years of daily use. She had $99 and a notebook and a kitchen that needed to meet health code standards before it could be used commercially, and a front room that needed cleaning, and the outdoor terrace on the Merchant Road side that needed assessment before she would know what it required. She also had 41 pages of her own in her own notebook, and 15 years of cooking at a level that had been feeding Marcus's professional contacts and making their evenings go well and generating comments that people had given to him as the host and that had originated in her hands. She thought about Marcus saying count in the way he used the word, with the implicit qualifier of what I mean by count. She thought about what he had thought he was leaving her with when he had arranged the accounts in his name and presumed the agreement he had always received. She thought about $312 and a key that had required patient jiggling, and a notebook on a shelf between salt and dried herbs that had been waiting in a closed building for 4 years for someone to come in and understand what it was. She picked up her phone and called the number she had found during her 9 days of research, the County Health Department's Small Business Food Service Licensing Division, and asked what the process was for bringing a formerly licensed commercial kitchen into current compliance, and what the minimum requirements were, and what the timeline looked like. The woman who answered walked her through it with the practical efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and understood that the people calling this number were people who needed clear information rather than discouragement. The minimum requirements were specific, and the timeline was manageable. And some of the work was work Nadia could do herself, and some required licensed professionals. And the licensed professionals had rates that she would need to cover through means she did not yet have. She wrote it all down. After she ended the call, she looked at Josephine. She said she needed to raise money to cover the compliance costs and the professional work that the licensing required. Josephine said she had been thinking about that while Nadia was on the phone. She said that in her professional opinion, which was a marketing professional's opinion, and therefore relevant, the story of what Nadia was doing had value. A woman starting over at 47 with the last of her money in a neighborhood that had been waiting for something good to return to the corner of Aldine and Merchant. She said that people gave money to stories they believed in, and that the story of Gloria's reopening as something new was a story people in Carver Hill specifically, and the city generally, had a reason to believe in. Nadia said she had not thought about it as a story. Josephine said everything was a story, and the question was whether the person it was happening to was willing to tell it. Nadia looked at the notebook on the prep counter, at Gloria's handwriting in the margins, and the 27 years of a person knowing what they were doing and recording the knowing so that it would outlast the knowing. She said she was willing to tell it. She said she wanted to call it something that reflected what it actually was, which was two women's work, and not only hers. Josephine asked what she was thinking. Nadia said she was thinking about a name that had Gloria in it, and something else in it, and that the something else was still forming, but that it would come. She went back to the front room and stood at the window and looked out at the corner. The bus stop on the Merchant roadside, the park across the street, the three-direction visibility, the specific quality of a corner that had been good once and was waiting to be good again. Bet from the alteration shop was on the pavement outside, pretending to arrange something in her window display, watching the building with the alert attention of someone who was monitoring a situation they had decided to be invested in. Nadia went to the front door and opened it. Bet looked over. Nadia said she had found the notebook. Bet's expression moved through something quickly and settled into the specific look of a person receiving news they had hoped for and had not been certain of. She said, was it where she thought? Nadia said it was exactly where she thought. Bet was quiet for a moment. Then she said Gloria would have been glad. Nadia said she thought so too. She said she was going to need help with some things and that she would rather ask people who had known this corner and this building than people who had not, and that she was going to start with Betty if Betty was willing. Betty said she had been waiting 4 years for someone to open that door properly. She came inside. They stood in Gloria's room, in the afternoon light coming through the windows that had been covered from inside for 4 years, and that Nadia had opened when she came in. The light falling on the 4 tables and the wooden chairs and the counter, and the pass-through window to the kitchen, where a notebook was open on the prep counter. Marcus had thought he was leaving her with nothing. He had left her with $411 and a 15-year education in how to make something excellent, and the specific clear sight of a woman who had stopped pretending she did not know what she knew. She knew what she was doing. She had always known. Now she had a place to do it in. She went back to the kitchen and picked up Gloria's notebook and her own notebook and set them side by side on the prep counter. 2 women's work. She opened hers to a fresh page and began to write.